Greetings from Columbia Business School Executive Education. I'm Scott Gardner. I'm happy to be here today with Willie Pietersen and Peter Meola for today's webinar, How Does the Pandemic Change the Way We Think About Strategy? Before I introduce Willie and Peter, I'll just go over a few quick logistics for the webinar. If you'll see on the next slide, a recording of this webinar will be emailed to you. If you'd like to tweet about the webinar, please do so at #CBSExecEd. And please submit those questions to the Q&A box. We'll get to as many of those as possible in the last 10 minutes. One additional logistic today, many of you have attended previous webinars that have been 30 minutes. Today's webinar will be 45 minutes, 30 minutes of content and 15 minutes of Q&A. Thank you. It's my pleasure to introduce Willie Pietersen. He is the Professor of Practice of Management at Columbia Business School. Over a period of 20 years, he served as the CEO of multi-billion-dollar businesses such as Lever Foods, Seagram USA, Tropicana, and Sterling Winthrop's Consumer Health Group. He is the author of Strategic Learning, How to Be Smarter Than Your Competition and Turn Key Insights into Competitive Advantage. His methods and ideas, especially in strategic learning, are widely applied within Columbia's executive education programs, as well as in numerous corporations. Peter Meola is a longtime faculty member at Columbia Business School Executive Education. His primary area of focus and passion are leadership of organizational culture and strategic learning as a leadership process. For more than 25 years, he has held a variety of senior executive roles in multiple global firms, including Unilever, Lysol, the Seagram Company, Tropicana, Burma Castrol, and BP. Willie and Peter are both also the co-faculty directors of our upcoming Creating Breakthrough Strategies program taking place live online this October. Peter, Willie, it's great to be with you today.
Thank you, Scott, very much indeed for that introduction, and a big welcome to everybody who has signed on today, wherever you may be. So we've got a big question ahead of us here. How does the pandemic change the way we think about strategy? Do the old methods still work? Do we have to rethink it and do things differently? Now, let me start by just talking about, okay, I'm trying to advance the slide. There it is. You know, the pandemic, if you think about it, has been the biggest crisis that we've suffered in healthcare for the last 100 years. And in the process of battling against it, we've learned some really important lessons, and some of them have carried a pretty heavy cost. Now, when we pay the heavy cost, we also want to have a benefit. So the big questions that we want to address here in this webinar are, number one, what have these lessons taught us about how to lead effectively through a crisis? That's question one. And then really importantly, question two, what have these lessons taught us about leading more effectively as strategic leaders beyond the crisis? What things have we learned that enable us to do that? Now, what I'm going to do is to try and identify some of those critical lessons that we've learned thus far from leading through this crisis. And then hand over to Peter, who will talk about some very specific concrete techniques that we've developed together to help to translate these ideas into action. So the first thing to understand is that the pandemic is a classical disruption. And a disruption is actually a very destructive event. It overturns all of our comfortable assumptions about how the world works. All of our, the areas of continuity are severed, and we enter a situation of high uncertainty and, of course, a lot of anxiety. And what this does, it calls on us to the highest levels of leadership effectiveness. So let's talk about those challenges. Let's go first of all to Peter Drucker. He gives us a warning here that the greatest danger in times of turbulence is not the turbulence itself, it's acting with yesterday's logic. And so often our thinking gets frozen, and our default position is to go to the prior rules of success and try and apply those prior rules to the new conditions. Of course, what we need to do is rapidly understand what those new conditions are and then apply that learning to coping with them effectively. Now, not all of these new rules are negative. We've been forced to innovate during this period of time, learn to do new things in these conditions and these constraints. And some of those are pretty useful as well. So it's kind of a mixed bag. I think of just two positive ones off the top of my head. One is telemedicine. You know, the Philips Corporation in the Netherlands have just announced that they're placing a huge bet on telemedicine. And that's because they've invented all kinds of new things that are possible to do now. And think about it from a customer point of view, how convenient that is to have these kinds of routine medical consultations online, as opposed to going to a crowded waiting room, spending half a day waiting, etc. And this is beginning to be a big new area in healthcare. Same thing true in education, where we've discovered a whole lot of new techniques. There's a kind of a burgeoning technology happening. So it's that kind of a mixed bag. Now, at the end of the day, what we have to do here is learn our way to success in handling this crisis. First level of analysis is to understand that there are two kinds of crises, and we need to adapt and tailor the kind of learning we apply to each of these. The first kind of crisis is what I call an episodic crisis. These are sudden and catastrophic crises or events, but they're short-lived. But they leave an aftermath of destruction. There are natural disasters, hurricanes, floods. The 9/11 terrorist attack was another one of these. It's catastrophic and shocking when it happens, but it's short duration. And then we have to collect ourselves and learn after the event. Then there are emergent crises. These involve a relentless escalating flow of harm in conditions of very high uncertainty and where there's no clear end point. And the COVID epidemic or pandemic is an example of that kind of crisis, and we have to tailor our learning accordingly. So let's just look at episodic crises briefly before we move on. What's the method of learning that's required here? We are confronted with these from time to time. Now, the American military, and I think many other militaries around the world, have adopted this process called the after-action review, which is a very, very good discipline, learning discipline. Basically, it answers 4 questions. What was meant to happen? What, in other words, were normal conditions? What actually happened that was different? Diagnostically, root cause analysis, why did it happen? Not blaming people for what happened, but understanding root causes. And then how can we prevent it from happening again? Very simple questions. This after-action review typically has a very, very skilled facilitator. So we maintain intellectual honesty and objectivity, etc. Now, you know, I give you one example here, which is a bit of a sinister example in many ways, is that if you think about air travel, every time there's a plane crash, aviation gets safer. And the reason for that is that the aviation industry are outstanding at doing these kinds of after-action reviews and rapidly disseminating the findings afterwards. So that's kind of an example of effective learning from episodic crises. But now let's look at the emergent crises. This is what we're handling right now. This is a very different kind of learning that's required. There's a process of continuous assessment and reassessment with rapid learning loops in real time, not after the event, in real time. We have to navigate through this in real time. And there's an adverse ratio of unknowns to knowns. We're in a process of constant discovery, of learning and unlearning, as Alvin Toffler so vividly reminded us, that we constantly have to unlearn as we learn new things that apply. So as we think about this now further, and this kind of process of rapid learning and emergent crises, we've got this Alvin Toffler definition here, so I won't go through that again. But here's a critical feature of the pandemic, or the hallmark, if you like, of the pandemic. and that is the exponential function. Now, here's the interesting thing about this. If you just typically ask an everyday person, what does exponential mean? The answer you get is probably, oh, it means very fast. Well, that's not an accurate answer, actually, and it's not useful at all. It's very slow first, and then fast. And that understanding that is absolutely crucial. So we must react in the slow phase, or we lose control. Now, here's the physicist Albert Bartlett. He says the greatest shortcoming in the human race, this is a big dramatic statement, is our inability to understand the exponential function. And this is, of course, vital, in fact, in many ways, a life and death requirement during a pandemic like this, to understand how it really works. So what I'd like to do is pose a little problem here and ask this question. If we imagine that there is a lily pad, you know, it's kind of a flower that floats on water, and it's in a pond. And it starts with one lily pad. And the number of lily pads doubles every day, to the point that after 30 days, the entire pond is covered in lily pads. Okay, so that's the scenario. So here's the single lily pad. Okay, there's the pond. Now, so my question is, if the pond is covered if the lily pads are covered the entire pond in 30 days, how many days does it take to cover half of the pond? Now, our normal way of thinking is to think in linear terms. So we'll say, well, it's 15 days. It's half the number of days. And of course, that's wildly inaccurate. You know, to our minds, exponential thinking is not logical. Linear thinking is logical. So that's a big trap. Now, the true answer is that after 15 days, 0.0031% of the pond has been covered. And the true answer is half the pond is covered in 29 days, one day before the 30th day. That's a surprise. Let's examine how this works. All right, so there's your 15-day mark. 0.0031% is covered. Now let's see how that evolves. After 24 days, only 2% is covered. Now I use that marker to illustrate the point that all of the runaway action occurs in the final 6 days. And we have this period of 24 days in which to act or lose control. So now we go to 28 days and we've got 25% covered. 29 days is 50% covered, and there it is at 30 days. Now, the way that we can sort out this logic is if you start at 30 days, and you'll know that's 100%, and it doubles every day, then the prior day could be only 50% because it's half of the full. Now, we don't think that way. We think in linear terms. And we have to really master this form of thinking if we're going to handle something like a pandemic effectively. Now, we need a very good technique to be able to handle a situation like this. Ad hoc decision-making simply doesn't cut it at all. So what I'd like to do is to introduce you to a process that I've created. It's called strategic learning. And it was specifically designed for us to have a practical process that is fit for purpose in highly dynamic environments, which is the environment we live in. Environment is dynamic, and my proposition is that the old static methods of doing strategy no longer work because they are not fit for purpose in a dynamic, fast-changing environment that's full of disruptions all the time. So it's a 4-step process that represents a shift of gear from strategy as planning to strategy as learning. And it allows us to go through the process of continuous assessment and reassessment as the environment changes. So there are 4 steps that move in a cycle, always starting with a situation analysis, where we look at the external environment, our internal realities, develop the insights, understand what they are, and then focus. So we go from learn to focus. What are we going to do? What is the best way forward? What is what I call our winning proposition and key priorities? And then we make an alignment of the entire business system behind that strategy. Then we implement, do lots of experiments if we don't know what might work. And then the whole thing is the learning loop back to the situation analysis. What worked, what didn't, and why? How has the environment shifted? And then back to adjusting our winning proposition accordingly. So that in brief is how it works. If you want to know more about it, if you go onto my website, there's a workbook, etc., that takes you through it. But look, I'm not trying to sell anything here, but I just wanted to just give you a quick overview at this stage. Now, before I hand over to Peter, here's an interesting thing I discovered. And by the way, this was totally coincidental. I didn't build off that. I discovered this afterwards, but it's a very interesting kind of convergence of thinking. It's called the UDAR Loop, and it's the Royal Air Force method for conducting intelligent air combat. And air combat is chaotic. It changes every second. And it's really a matter of life and death for these pilots to learn a technique. And it's very simple because it has these same 4 steps: observe, orient, decide, and act. So first thing you do is observe your external environment. Where's the enemy? Where's my squadron? Etc. Then orient. Where am I in relation to my external environment? Then decide, what am I going to do? What am I not going to do? And then act very rapidly. No dithering. You have to act rapidly. By the time you've acted, all the pieces have been scrambled, and you go back to observing again what the new situation is, and you orientate yourself and go through the cycle again. And this is what they say as the payoff. If your enemy's UDAR loop is faster and better than yours, he will shoot you down. If your UDAR loop is faster and better than your enemy's, you will shoot him down. Matter of life and death, mastering this way. And the sequence, of course, is vitally important. So there's this convergence, and what I think, as I leave my section and hand over to Peter, is what I'm really offering here is we need a process of very rapid learning and assessment and reassessment in real time. We need a technique that enables us to do this. And it ad hoc just doesn't work. So I've offered you that kind of way of thinking and put an emphasis on the fact that exponential growth needs a special kind of understanding and treatment. And waiting too long can be fatal. All right, with all that said, Peter, over to my friend Peter Meola, who will now talk about some of the specific techniques that we've developed to handle this kind of situation. So over to you.
Thank
Peter.
you, Willie. And I'll wait, I'm going to share my screen.
While Peter is sharing his screen, I just want to remind all the participants, please submit those questions to the Q&A box and we'll get to as many of those as possible.
Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending upon where you are on this globe. I want to continue the discussion that Willie has started briefly, and I want to focus now on some key learning methods or techniques or approaches to help combat and deal with emergent crises. Let's review some of those that might apply to both governmental and organizational levels when dealing with such a crisis. Firstly, and you've seen this slide before, although I have a check mark on the essential first step to conduct a situation analysis, we suggest an adept capability to initiate a fast, collaborative, effective strategy. An implementation process is really effective. What we find from time to time with some clients is that they reinvent the process every time they think there is a need. What we'd want you to do is to enable rapid learning is not spend a lot of time on figuring out how to operate the process, but have that done well ahead of the time. Institutionalize, if you will, a methodology, its language, and the know-how to implement it if and when you need it in a very, very timely manner. The crisis isn't going to wait for you to learn. So you want to spend the time applying it. Here, as Willie suggested, is the strategic learning method, which has been road tested and taught by us for many years, and it fulfills the need for dynamic learning and continuous recalibration as events unfold. Key here are rapid learning and continuous application of that learning in developing a robust strategy and ultimately executing it. As you can see, it's a learning loop, as he's referred to, which is the essential ingredient, and its essential first step is the situation analysis. That's where we start. Let's talk a little bit more about that. Secondly, as part of the situation analysis, is applying your learning and your insights, importantly, to produce a frame of the challenge that you face. The challenge clearly defines the nature of the problem and its implications. Here you see some examples associated with the pandemic. Now, these aren't just nice words to have on a PowerPoint. Its purpose is so everyone knows the problem and the need for collective commitment and fast action to overcome it. It's really a rallying cry, but also importantly, an organizing principle from which strategy is developed and ultimately executed. It begins to shape behaviors in the organization, a strategy and an activity set to deal with the crisis. So framing of the challenge, there are a few words, but they're very, very powerful and should resonate in the organization. It becomes the basis from which you consider alternative options to deal with the condition. Thirdly, the pandemic challenged us into rapid learning mode due to the threat of exponential growth, as Willie's talked about. And when the virus reaches such a peak, chaos ensues, in fact, if your learning doesn't keep up with it or accelerate before that, okay? Said another way, we were challenged to avoid the experience of a relentless flow of escalating harm. Once the virus outpaces our learning and attack plan, chaos does ensue. This all requires rapid, continuous, and truthful shared learning. And I reiterate, truthful shared learning with incomplete information in a fast, and in many cases, a changeable environment. Truth and transparency are keys, and importantly, both the physical and emotional toll on all shareholders can be relieved, or stakeholders can be relieved if you get it right. Truth, again, is very important, and the transparency of that truth and the insights. It's for you to consider the quality by which the pandemic has been handled in your locale. I'll leave that for you. Fourth, it's not good enough just to learn. You need to learn fast, and it has to be of high quality. And winning the battle for insights is really critical here. It requires a sense and respond orientation, and the feedback loop is important, as Willie's alluded to. This is a helpful depiction of that aspiration. Having the capability to sense essential insights before they become too apparent and potentially dangerous is the key to winning. Being too late, as you can see here, limits your optionality to deal with the crisis. The globe is cluttered with all kinds of once successful industries, organizations that got it wrong. Kodak missed digital photography. The old music or traditional music industry skipped on the technology and missed largely the streaming phenomenon. And maybe, just maybe, our traditional automobile manufacturers are going to be late to the party as it relates to electric power and autonomous driving. So I'd ask you to consider that. Once we look at this, it's nice to look at it and say, gee, that's really important that I operate in the optimal action phase here. But the obvious next question becomes, how do I do it? How do I do it? And I'd want you to reflect on areas and ways your current organization may or may not do it, but I'm going to give you some very important tips here that we've used over the years that have really helped guide this insight generation. The first one is to be fast and data driven. Value facts, not fiction. That's not to say you don't value people's inherent experience and knowledge of the business, but sometimes there are biases, and what become facts slowly evolve into stories, and sometimes they get over exaggerated. Very important to make sure that you are data driven as you continue. The second thing, as you see here, is utilizing clear and simple leading and lagging indicators, important measurements. By example, hospitalizations or the number of cases are leading indicators for the pandemic, while maybe net promoter scores, out of stocks, or even customer complaints are all leading indicators for traditional organizations. Lagging indicators are such measures like market share in traditional organizations, but unfortunately, deaths are the lagging indicator for COVID. Focus and attention to leading indicators results in successful lagging indicators and, quite frankly, ultimate success. The third item I have here is measuring trends, because they tell a story or reveal patterns. Snapshots, we contend, are just a point in time, not very helpful. For COVID, the number of cases, hospital admissions, and deaths should all be trend measured to assess just how it's going. The fourth one is to disaggregate key information. I can't underscore this one enough. Disaggregation helps find where the cases are, like in nursing homes and specific geographies, and among whom, like age groups and amongst those with preconditions or not. So one can provide focused attention and apply the resources that are required. All considered, folks, encouraging a culture of disciplined, transparent, and truthful learning is foundational to the whole effort. And remember this, don't apply the wrong tools when dealing with an emergent crisis. By example, this would be applying episodic crisis orientation to an emergent crisis, because you'll get crushed. You'll be waiting too long, and obviously, as Willie has indicated, right, the path will accelerate and crush you, and chaos would ensue. I want you to think for a second, because I know what I read about the pandemic in business journals, business writings, is a lot of short-term orientation. What are we going to do today? How are we going to get ourselves through this so that everything goes back to the way it was? Very few articles are talking about, very few elements of the discussion are talking about what might be the long-lasting impacts of this emergent crisis. And I have both short-term and long-term questions here for you. You might see sales eroding, even if your market share is stable today, because you don't necessarily have an indicator, but you'll see sales eroding. Long-term, have you thought about your supply chain exposure? In the past, most organizations have set up their supply chain such that they try to maximize quality, but doing it at the lowest cost possible, right? And that's caused some organizations to have their supply chains in very few geographic areas, putting all their eggs in one basket. Given the experience today, maybe the consideration should be that your posture or your position is wrong, and you need to be more geographically diverse going forward. And that's just not a temporary challenge. The second one you see here is meeting customer needs. How important is having an online presence going forward? We know that this was a trend that was taking place well before the pandemic, but in both cases, supply chain as well as customer needs, it's hard to argue that this pandemic has not accelerated those trends, and not for the short term, but for the long term. To that end, once the pandemic is past, its impact might be long lasting, but these same skills and orientations that Willie and I just spoke about will be very, very important. So organizations are more agile and thus more competitive in the future. I'd ask you to reflect on this discussion in terms of your own capabilities and within your own domains of accountability, how well you do it. So I'd like to go to the question and answer slide and turn it over to Scott to help us through that. And we're very open to any and all questions you might have.
Thank you, Willie. Thank you, Peter. A lot of great information. And my phone that I track all the questions has been blowing up with a wonderful question. So ready for some Q&A?
Sure thing.
All right. A lot of the themes of the questions are kind of centering around timing and unknowns, people's fear of those unknowns and timing. So I'm going to kick off the first one, Willie, with a question from Ram. This is one of the key challenges in an uncertain environment is the knowing versus the doing gap, given unknown variables. Do you have any thoughts on how to address this?
Yeah, very good question. Thank you. I actually would suggest to you there are two gaps, not just one. There's knowing to doing, and then from doing to excelling. Doing is just not enough for us. I think what we want to really do is to excel at what we achieve. Working through the unknown is simply a process of rapid learning, unlearning, and relearning. And, being able to say, this is what we discovered along the way. This was wrong, as we've learned now, because it was our best judgment at the time. And this is the course correction that we're suggesting is the only way through this. There's no certainty at the beginning of it. There are many, many unknowns. And we simply have to admit it at the outset and say, here's the process of discovery that we're going to be embarking on, and we'll tell you the truth along the way. There was a lot of uncertainty at the beginning of this about wearing masks, for example. Even the World Health Organization was uncertain about that. And then the data came in. And the data demonstrated that it was pretty effective because it's an airborne virus, and that was not well understood. Then the other thing is there are a lot of asymptomatic spreaders as well. Now, all that added up over time was not known at the outset. But as we learn, we adapt. So it's very, very evolutionary. It's the ability to adapt rapidly to changing circumstances.
Okay. Another question came in that I'd like to, Peter, maybe I can throw this one out to you. This is from Linda. In the general sense, as we're going through this process, are there areas of leadership that remain unchanged in the face of this pandemic?
That's a very good question. And I can't help think about a model that we use for leadership at Columbia and teach it. It's called the integrated leadership model. And it suggests that there are three domains of leadership, all of which are equally important. The first one is personal leadership. Do you really understand yourself? Ask the question, who am I? Do you really understand yourself? And can you convey yourself in an authentic, genuine manner? Do you have a core set of values that you're founded on? And what are they? And can you capitalize on those for truth and performance, quite honestly? The second piece is interpersonal leadership. And that asks the question, who are we as an organization? What are we as an organization? And those are interpersonal skills that allow you to connect with those around you who you're leading in a very, very motivating, productive manner. And then there's the third one, and this gets to the crux of your question, I think, and that's the third element, and that is what we call strategic leadership. It's not good enough knowing yourself and being good interpersonally with others. You then have to ask yourself in an organizational context, in service of what? And that becomes the fourth pillar here, strategic leadership, which asks the question, how will we win? It's all in service in an organizational context about how we win. What is your strategy? Now you ask the question, do any of these change? The only thing that changes is within your strategic leadership bucket, the actual pace of learning. And Willie talked about exponential growth. So the better you integrate your leadership across these three areas or domains, the better you will be to accelerate leadership within your organization, to confront crises, and particularly emerging crises. The only thing that really changes is the speed of required learning here. That's what I would suggest. You should all work continuously on improving and maximizing your capability of all three domains of leadership.
Thank you. So this, in the terms of the timing, I'm glad you said that, Peter, because I have two questions I'm going to combine. I think they sort of interrelate in terms of the timing aspect that you outlined, particularly with the LilyPod example. So Kate, I'm going to read Kate and Chris's questions. Kate says, I hear rapid learning, but also references to the slow phase with respect to episodic crises. Could you perhaps clarify when to move quickly and when to slow down? And Chris also asks, at what point do the panel, do Willie and Peter think that we recognize an exponential problem? In other words, if we're using the LilyPad example and there's only a 0.0031% issue at halfway through the crisis, are we doomed to never really figure out the issue until it's too late? So this is really...
Well, okay, let me start on this, try to answer this one. These are challenging questions. I think the way to approach the first one is, this is the issue of what pace we should move at. The pace we move at is dictated by our external environment, not by our own impulses or intuitions or decisions. What we decide to do is not relevant unless it addresses the external realities. And success occurs outside the boundaries of our organization, not inside. Inside is where we mobilize our resources. So that's what dictates how fast we should move. And if we move more slowly than the external environment is changing, then that gap will get us into trouble. Now, how do we recognize whether something is exponential? This is a much more difficult question. I think in the context of this pandemic, there are a lot of lessons. There was the 1918 Spanish flu that taught a lot of lessons. So we recognize at the outset that that's the nature of these, that's the hallmark of these pandemics. So we need to go and consult with the specialists, the epidemiologists, the medical experts, etc., to really understand how these things evolve. To try and do it as a layperson just doesn't work, because there are lessons learned about how these things evolve. And it was known at the outset that once these things get started, they become exponential. The rest is, what does that mean? What does that mean in terms of how it grows, that there's a slow phase during which we have time to contend with it, to contain it. And if we wait too long, we lose control and it runs away from us. And I think that's where we need to consult with the experts. But it is a well-known fact amongst the experts that pandemics have this hallmark of being exponential.
Right, thank you. And I think that goes to your Drucker quote, which is, you're not using yesterday's processes, but there is information from the past you can use, right? To go forward.
Yes, indeed. But there are other situations beyond the pandemic that might be exponential. I think that's what people have in mind as well. If we move out of the realm of healthcare and a pandemic, etc., which is not an everyday event, there are other things that can become exponential. I mean, one example I would just cite here is the introduction of the iPhone by Apple, which was a sudden revolution. And you got, players like BlackBerry and Nokia literally obliterated in a period of about 12 months.
Right.
And neither of them exist. Well, Nokia doesn't exist. It was gobbled up by Microsoft and then disappeared off the map, essentially. And now they're doing telecom infrastructure at Nokia. BlackBerry is kind of, doing some patent work, etc. And that was a kind of a period of about 15, 16 months when that happened. That's a kind of a rare event. But the rule of the road always in these things is to pick up the early signals. It's better to act early or do a lot of experiments early because in situations like that, being late is being wrong.
Right. So there's another.
If I can just add to that, I mean, we've been talking about this, the idea, the notion of exponential growth, but the big fear in a lot of organizations sort of reverse that and say, what about exponential decline? And I talked to you a little bit about some examples, although there's a whole list of organizations that never got on board, right? And they see their business slowly erode early on, never really confront it because of all the great success they've had in the past. They think it's just going to continue. And what happens is all of a sudden you hit a wall and you fall off of a cliff because more and more customers desert you in a much more rapid rate. And it's just not, as Willie was talking about, this linear erosion, but an exponential erosion.
Yeah, General Electric, General Motors, good examples. Kodak, you cited.
Yep.
It starts with a slow decline. It's a bit like the boiled frog, you know, that the little example of the boiled frog boiling by degrees, because in each small degree, it doesn't seem dangerous, but the totality leads to a boiled frog.
Right. So we've got about 3 minutes left. I'm going to combine two questions, and then I have another final question for you too. So this combined set of questions right now is more in the terms of culture. So talking about, the transformation at the personal level, as well as the organizational level. And in your view, what is the role of these two levels in transforming during a crisis? And that was followed up by, that was from Chuck. Sebastian followed up by saying, during this strategic learning loop, how would you reduce the biases caused by corporate culture? So these two are more in relation to the culture of what's happening during this crisis.
Pete, culture.
Yeah, you want me to take that one? I'll take that one. First of all, and I counsel students as well as clients on this all the time, because it's one of the first discussions we have before we embark on, as an example, applying the strategic learning process. And that is, and I reiterate this need for credible, true, transparent learning. We have a lot of biases, individual biases as well as corporate biases. All that, quite honestly, aren't very helpful if your aspiration is to get truthful, transparent learning. And I encourage organizations to have these conversations early on, right at the outset, to recognize them, that they're in all of us to some level or another, and to make a bond or make an agreement to constructively call that out when we see them, quite honestly. All right. There is more people than not resist change. Let's be quite honest about this. And there are many reasons for that. Sometimes because we've been very successful in the past and we think it's just going to continue. But as hard as you've worked to be successful in the past, that does not give you the automatic right to be successful. Because as we're suggesting, the world is changing. You're always sensing and responding to what the environment is offering, and then you build your organization to actually capitalize on that. You know, we have discussions about strategy a lot in our in-person sessions in many cases, and people say, we'll ask the question, how do you do strategy? They say, well, we do this as an organization really, really well, and then we look for places where there is fertile ground to capitalize it. And we have a great conversation about saying, well, that's sort of in reverse. The world isn't waiting for necessarily for what you do well. The world is waiting to get the benefits that they need from a competitor or competitor set that can serve them the best. So it's not inside out thinking, it's outside in thinking on that one.
Great, thank you. We're at 12:45, but I must ask this last question. So I've asked our producer for a few extra minutes. I think this is a great final question. One of the ways that we try to end every webinar is with, what do I do next? What is a key takeaway? And so Bill sent this in. What are 3 core priorities for organizational strategy in times of crisis?
Okay, well, let me try and just briefly give you my thoughts on that. Rule number 1, tell the truth. Tell the truth early. If you don't do that, people start rumors, you lose credibility, and you become defensive. If you don't tell the truth, you're making a false assumption. That assumption is that you can deal with the truth, but other people can't. And if you think about it, that's rather arrogant. They may be able to deal with it much better than you can. And they deal with it a lot better. People are a lot more resilient than we imagine if you tell them the truth. Second, be transparent. Have a set of measurements that truthfully map out what's happening, maps out progress, what do we need to do next, what's the new learning, et cetera, et cetera. So be transparent. And the third one, simplify complexity. Use metaphors, use pictures. You know, we need to flatten the curve. Andrew Cuomo, the governor of New York, for example, used the metaphor of, we need to look at the dials that tell us what we're doing. And then we've got a valve we can close or open to allow more or less freedom, et cetera. And that was a kind of great metaphor to use to give people a grasp of what's happening. Simplify complexity. If people get confused, they get paralyzed and they get afraid. Those are my three.
Peter, do you have anything to add, or shall we close?
That sounds good to me. Those are
Very
spot on.
Very specific, very measurable. Thank you, Willie. Thank you, Peter. And on behalf of Willie and Peter and myself and Columbia Business School Executive Education, thank you very much for attending today. We hope to see you in future webinars, future programs. Be safe and be well. Thank you.
Thank you, Scott. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.